The conservatory door at Ashbourne stood an inch ajar, and through it, on a wet October evening with a tray of coffee cooling in her hands, the Duchess of Ashbourne heard a woman's voice ask lazily, "And does he want her, Lucian, even a little?" and heard her husband laugh before he answered. Who could want her? Look at her, Serena. I married a pedigree, not a woman. I bought 400 years of name, and I got a dusty little scholar in the bargain, and if the name could have been had without the woman, I should have been a great deal happier. And the woman laughed too, low and delighted, and said that it was a pity to waste a duke on a set of old parchments, and the Duchess of Ashbourne stood in the passage with the coffee going cold in her hands, and did not push the door, and did not make a sound. If you have ever stood on the wrong side of a door and heard exactly what you were worth to somebody, you already know the particular kind of quiet that comes after that. What that quiet grew into over the following 9 months is the best thing I have ever had the pleasure of telling. Press subscribe so the ending does not get away from you. Leave a like if you believe the people who are laughed at are usually the only ones paying attention. And tell me in the comments what city you are watching from, and this. Would you have pushed that door open and let them see your face? Or would you have done what she did and walked back down the passage and waited 9 months? Because the Duke of Ashbourne had just asked, out loud in his own house, who could possibly want his wife? And the answer to that question was, at that very moment, 4 counties away, reading a letter about a boundary dispute and deciding to come and see the Beaumain charters for himself. To understand the whole of it, you must understand the 2 families. Because this was never really a story about a mistress. It was a story about what a name is worth, told between a man who had bought his and a woman who had inherited hers. The Vales of Ashbourne were not old. Their money had been made in 3 brisk years by the present Duke's grandfather, a Manchester man of terrible energy who had contracted to supply the army in America with boots, blankets, and salt beef, and who had emerged from that war with a fortune, an estate, and, in 1784, a dukedom, granted by a government that needed his loans more than its own dignity. 40 years later, the Vales were among the richest families in England and among the newest, and nobody who had ever been sneered at in a London drawing room will be surprised to learn that no family in the kingdom was quicker to sneer. Lucian Vale, the 3rd Duke, inherited at 26. He was handsome, athletic, admired, and possessed of a private terror he would not have confessed under torture, which was that in the oldest rooms in England his title was still a joke about boots. The Beaumains were the opposite catastrophe. They had come over with a Norman bishop, held their manor in the north from the 12th century, given a chancellor to one king, and a corpse to Agincourt, founded a chantry and an almshouse, and then, over 4 centuries, lost everything. Recusancy fines took the first third, a civil war the second, and 2 generations of gentle, unbusinesslike men the rest. By the time Charlotte Beaumain was born, the family consisted of one scholarly widower in a house with a leaking roof and a daughter, and their entire estate was the ruined manor, 11 acres. The advowson, the almshouse they could no longer afford to endow, and, in a stone-vaulted room off the old hall, the muniments. 900 charters, deeds, grants, quitclaims, court rolls, wills, and the Chantry Foundation, going back in an unbroken line to 1189, one of the 4 or 5 finest private archives in England, worth, to a scholar, more than the house, and worth, to a bank, precisely nothing. Charlotte grew up in that room. Her father taught her to read the hands the way other fathers teach a boy to fish, patiently, badly at first, then well. And by the time she was 20, she could date a document within 15 years by the shape of its letters, read court hand and secretary hand and chancery Latin at sight, and tell you what a scribe had eaten for breakfast if he had been careless with his pen. It was not an accomplishment that got a woman married. She was plain, she was poor, she was 27, and she had made her peace with all three, and she was standing on a stepladder in the muniment room with a 15th century terrier in her hands when her father came in and told her, in a voice she had never heard him use, that the Duke of Ashbourne had written asking for her hand, and that he had never in his life been so surprised by anything. Neither had she. It took her 4 days to understand what a man with a new name might want with an old one, and by then she had already said yes. Because her father was 68, and the roof was gone, and the almshouse had 4 old women in it who ate what Charlotte could carry them. And because when a duke offers to save everything you love, you do not ask him why until much later. He wanted the name, and he got it, and for about 6 weeks he was pleased with his purchase. Charlotte understood the shape of her marriage on the night of the first great dinner at Ashbourne, when her husband walked 20 guests along the long gallery after the ladies had rejoined, and stopped them before the newly hung Beaumain quarterings, painted up in fresh gold on a board that had been ordered before the wedding, and delivered, without once looking at his wife, a 5-minute account of the descent of her family from the reign of Henry II the Chancellor, the man who fell at Agincourt, the Chantry, the unbroken line to her father, accurate in every particular, because he had made her write it out for him. And when it was finished, a lady asked, pleasantly, whether the Duchess did not find it thrilling to have so ancient a lineage, and Lucian answered before Charlotte could open her mouth. "Oh, she has no notion of it," he said. "She is quite the antiquary, ink to the elbows, but she has no more sense of what it means than the parson's cat. Come and see the plate." And they went, laughing, and the Duchess of Ashbourne stood alone under her own arms in the gallery for a moment, and understood that she had been hung on the wall along with the shield, and that the shield was preferred, because the shield did not have a face. That was the pattern of 5 years. He was not violent, and he was not, by the standards of his set, unkind. He was something worse, which was ashamed. He was ashamed of her plainness, which he had seen perfectly well before he married her, and had assumed, in the way of men who have never wanted anything they could not buy, that money would fix. He was ashamed of her ink-stained fingers, and her habit of correcting a guest who misdated a portrait. He was ashamed, above all, of the fact that his one claim to true antiquity had arrived in the person of a small, quiet, unfashionable woman whom no one in London looked at twice. And every time somebody failed to look at her, he felt the boots and the salt beef come a little closer. And he punished her for it in 100 small ways that no court in England would have recognised as a crime. He gave her a generous allowance and stopped dining at home. He took her to London twice and left her at the edges of rooms. He called her, in company, my antiquary, in the tone a man uses about a favourite dog with an odd habit. And she, who had come into that marriage with no illusions about love, but a real, bright, girlish hope of usefulness, took the only kingdom he left unguarded, and made it hers. The muniments came to Ashbourne as part of the marriage, and were housed, at her request, in the old estate office beyond the library, and it was there that Charlotte Vale spent 5 years, and became, though almost nobody in England knew it, one of the 2 or 3 finest paleographers of her generation. She catalogued all 900 charters. She made a fair transcript of every one, in a hand as clear as print, with the Latin translated and the dates reasoned out and her workings shown, and she bound the transcripts in 12 volumes, and made, because her father had taught her that a copy in one place is a copy in no place, a second set of the most important 200, and kept it in a deal box under the window seat. She corresponded with the Society of Antiquaries under the initials CV, and an address in York, and Dr. Pennant, its president, spent 2 years believing he wrote to a retired clergyman, and wrote her a letter of such generous respect when he learned otherwise that she cried over it, which she had not done over anything her husband said in 5 years. And she took the parish, which is the part the tenants remembered. She endowed the almshouse out of her allowance and rebuilt its roof, and there were 9 old women in it by the 4th year instead of 4. She taught the Nash children to read and sat up with the sick. She knew, as her husband did not, that the Ashbourne home farm was drained on medieval ditches, whose courses were recorded in a 14th century court roll she could read, and no living engineer could find. Below stairs they worshipped her, and Mrs. Dunn, the housekeeper, said once to the cook that it was a strange thing to see a great lady treated as a lodger in her own house, stranger still to see her make no complaint, and that she would not care to be his grace on the day the account was called in. Charlotte made no complaint, because she had, quite deliberately, given up wanting anything from him. She had married to save a roof and an almshouse and an archive, and all 3 were saved. Nobody wanted her. She had known that since she was 17, and she had built a life that did not require it, and if there was an hour some evenings between the closing of the muniment room and the ringing of the dressing bell, when she stood at the window and felt the whole enormous flat silence of her life settle over her like snow, that was her own business, and she told nobody, and she went down to dinner. Lady Serena Crail came into their lives in the 5th spring, and she came, as such women often do, with impeccable credentials and empty pockets. She was the second daughter of the Earl of Crail, 29, celebrated for her figure and her tongue, possessed of 900 a year in debts of rather more, and she had spent 8 seasons discovering that a great name without money buys a woman admiration and no husband. She and Lucian Vale understood each other within a fortnight. He had money and no antiquity and burned for it, and she had antiquity and no money and was tired of being praised. What she offered him was the thing he could not buy, and had married a woman to obtain and had not obtained, which was the sensation of being effortlessly, indisputably at the top of the room, and she gave it to him by taking his arm in front of people whose grandmothers had cut his grandmother. By midsummer she was at Ashbourne for 6 weeks of the year, and by autumn the whole county knew. Charlotte knew first, and absorbed it as she absorbed everything, with a small surprise at how little it hurt. What did hurt, and hurt in a way she had not expected, was the method. Serena Crail never once insulted the Duchess. She was, on the surface, charming to her, and her charm was a scalpel. She would say at a table of 14, "Oh, we must not tease the Duchess. She is the only one of us who has ever done anything useful," and everyone would laugh, and Charlotte would be left holding the word useful like a dead bird. She would ask her sweetly to explain a Latin phrase, and when Charlotte had explained it, say how clever, I could never. I was too busy being taken about. And Lucian. who was not clever enough to see that his mistress was systematically establishing that his wife belonged among the servants and the books, laughed loudest of anyone. It was in the second summer of Serena that the objects began to move, and this is where the story turns from a bad marriage into a crime. In June, the chantry silver went. It was not treasure in the money sense. A chalice, a paten, and 2 cruets, 15th century, given by the Agincourt Beaumain, and kept in a locked case in the estate office. Mr. Ezra Halloway, the Duke's confidential attorney, who came up from London 4 times a year and was always at Lucian's elbow, mentioned at dinner that the Society for the Encouragement of Arts was mounting an exhibition of medieval plate, and that the Ashbourne pieces would show handsomely, and Lucian, delighted at any occasion to display the antiquity he had married, gave the order the same night. The silver went south in a padded case. The exhibition, when Charlotte wrote to inquire about it in September, turned out to have taken place 2 years earlier. In August, a charter went missing from the third press. She noticed it on a Tuesday because she had catalogued all 900 and could have told you what stood on either side of the gap. A grant of free warren of 1312 with a seal in fine condition, and she searched the room for 3 days before accepting what she already knew. In October, 2 more from the earliest series. The press had 2 keys. She held one. The other hung in the Duke's business room, where Mr. Halloway sat whenever he came north. So she did the thing she had been raised to do, which was to state a fact to the person responsible for it. She went to her husband in November with the catalogue under her arm and told him that 3 charters and the chantry silver had gone, that the silver had never gone to any exhibition, that the losses had all occurred within days of Mr. Halloway's visits, and that she wished the second key taken from the business room and the matter put before an attorney who was not Mr. Halloway. Lucian heard perhaps half of it. Then he laughed, not cruelly, which was somehow the worst of it, and said, "Charlotte, you have mislaid 3 pieces of parchment in a room with 900 of them, and you are accusing the man who has managed my family's affairs for 15 years of being a thief. Halloway sold my grandfather's Manchester interests for 4 times what they were worth. He is the ablest man I know. If you would come out of that room occasionally and get some air, you would not imagine things." And then he said the sentence she wrote down that night, word for word, in the front of the catalogue, because it was the first line of the account she had decided, at that moment, to begin keeping. "Really, my dear, nobody is stealing your rubbish. There is not a man in England who wants what is in that room." She said, "Very well," and went out and closed the door, and stood in the passage for a moment with the catalogue against her chest. And then she went down to the muniment room and began, that same evening, a plain interleaved notebook in which she recorded for 11 months every document in that press by number and condition. Every visit Mr. Halloway made to Ashbourne with its dates, and every occasion on which the business room key left its hook, which she could establish, because Alice, her maid, dusted that room at 7 each morning and was 19 and observant and adored her. The house party of that October was the largest Ashbourne had given. 22 staying guests over 11 days, shooting by day and cards by night, and Lady Serena Crail presided over it in all but title, while the Duchess ordered the meals, arranged the rooms, and was thanked by nobody. On the 4th evening it rained, and the party gathered in the long drawing-room, and somebody proposed a game of wagers. and Lucian Vale, 4 glasses in and expansive, laid a bet with Colonel Fanshawe of £50 that no man in that house could correctly name the Duchess's Christian name without looking at the visitor's book. It was not meant, he would say afterwards, as cruelty, and that was true, and it made it worse. It was a joke about how much of a nonentity his own wife was, made in her own drawing room. And the room laughed, and 3 men guessed wrong before Colonel Fanshawe, an honest old soldier who had gone quite red, said, "Her Grace's name is Charlotte Ashbourne, and I do not care for the wager." Charlotte, by the fire with her workbox, looked up and said, "Thank you, Colonel," and rang for more coffee, and it was carrying that coffee 20 minutes later past the conservatory door that stood an inch ajar that she heard the sentence with which this story began. And does he want her, Lucian, even a little? Want her? Who could want her? I married a pedigree, not a woman. She stood there for the length of about 6 breaths. Then she carried the tray back down the passage to the drawing-room, put it down, poured for Colonel Fanshawe and for 2 ladies, said good night to the company at 11:15 precisely as she did every night, and went upstairs, and Alice brushed her hair for her as usual, and neither of them said a word. When the girl had gone, Charlotte sat down at the little writing-table by the window, and for a while she did not cry and did not move. What she felt was not the wound. The wound had been dealt years ago, and she had learned to walk on it. What she felt was a kind of terrible clarity, the sensation of a fog lifting off a landscape she had been crossing blind for 5 years. Because she understood, in that hour, 3 things at once, and they arranged themselves in her mind as neatly as entries in a catalogue. The first was that her husband would never, under any circumstance in any year of their lives, come to want her, and that every small hope she had kept in the back of a drawer since her wedding was worthless paper and could be burned. The second was that he did not merely fail to love her. He was ashamed of her, and a man ashamed of his wife will eventually be persuaded to put her away, and the persuading had already begun in a conservatory an hour ago. And the third, which arrived last and coldest, was that a man who could be laughed into believing his own wife was nothing could be led into believing anything at all by a clever attorney, and that the missing charters were not the end of that business, but the beginning of it. She did not cry. She opened the interleaved notebook, turned to a clean page, and wrote at the top. In her clear cataloguer's hand, the date, and beneath it, the words spoken this evening in the conservatory, verbatim in quotation marks, with the name of the speaker, exactly as she would have recorded a marginal note in a 14th century roll. Then she turned back and began, methodically, to work through the whole of the last 2 years, listing every object that had left the house. Every date, every key, every witness who could be asked. It took her until 4 in the morning. And in the grey of it, sitting with her ink dry and her candle guttering and the rooks starting up in the park, Charlotte Vale made the decision that ended her marriage, and she made it, characteristically, in the form of a resolution about method. She would not accuse anybody again. She had accused twice and been laughed at twice, and she finally understood what her father had meant when he told her, over a disputed boundary when she was 15, that in the muniment room you never argue with a man about what a document says, you make him read it aloud in front of witnesses. She would say nothing more to her husband, ever, about the silver or the charters or Halloway or Serena. She would gather and copy and date and wait, and when she had the whole of it, she would put it in front of people who could not be laughed off, and let the papers speak, because papers unlike wives are listened to. She blew the candle out as the servants began moving below stairs and went to bed for 2 hours, and was in the muniment room at 9 as usual, and Mrs. Dunn, bringing up her coffee at 11, said afterwards that her Grace had looked precisely as she always looked, and that she had had, all the same, the distinct and unaccountable feeling of walking into a room where a fuse had been lit. The letter that changed everything arrived in February, and it was addressed, not to the Duke, but to the Beaumain muniments, care of Ashbourne, which told Charlotte at once that whoever had written it knew what he was about. It was from a Mr. Careless, who wrote on behalf of an estate in the West Riding disputing a boundary in a fishery, the documentary history of which ran through 2 13th-century grants believed to be in the Beaumain collection, and who asked, in 4 dry, courteous lines, whether he might consult them, and whether the Duchess'S transcripts might be available, since he understood from Dr. Pennant that they were of unusual accuracy. Charlotte read that last clause 3 times. Then she wrote back that he might come on the Tuesday. Mr. Careless arrived in a hired gig with 1 bag and no servant, a tall, weather-beaten, unhurried man of about 40, in a good but elderly brown coat, with a face that had spent a lot of time outdoors and hands that had done more than hold a pen, and the footman who admitted him took him for what the household decided he was within the hour, somebody's archivist, sent north to grub in the papers on his master's business. He was given the small room at the end of the bachelor passage. The Duke, informed at dinner that a scholar had come about the charters, said, God help him, and did not inquire further. And for 16 days Charlotte Vale and the man she believed to be Mr. Carey worked side by side at the long oak table in the muniment room, and it was the strangest and best fortnight of her adult life. Because he treated her from the first hour as a colleague of established reputation, and because he was, she realized by the second day, extremely good. He read court-hand almost as fast as she did, and was better on seals and worse on Latin abbreviation, and when she corrected his reading of a contracted formula, he sat back and said, Well, that is why I came north, and wrote the correction into his notes with her initials against it, and Charlotte discovered she had forgotten what it felt like to be quoted. He argued with her twice about the dating of a quitclaim, lost the first and won the second, and when he lost he said, with obvious pleasure, that he had been wrong for 11 years about that scribe, and was glad to be corrected before he published. They ate bread and cheese at the table at 2, because neither wanted to stop. On the 9th day, working through the 15th century series, he came upon the transcript volumes and read her introduction to them, 20 pages on the hands and the scribes of the Beaumain Chancery. And he put the volume down and said, quietly, Your Grace, this ought to be in print. Dr. Pennant told me the transcripts were good. He did not tell me they were the best work of their kind in England. Who taught you? My father, she said, in a house with no roof. He said, then he did the one thing with his life that will still matter in 200 years, and I hope somebody told him so. And Charlotte, to her own horror, had to get up and go and stand at the window for a moment and pretend to look at the rain. Twice in that fortnight her husband came into the muniment room, which he had entered perhaps 4 times in 5 years, and both times it was to fetch something, and both times he spoke to her as one speaks to an upper servant in front of a stranger. And on the second occasion, going out, he said, over his shoulder, still at it, my dear, do not let the clerk keep you from ordering the dinner. The door closed. Charlotte, Scarlet, kept her eyes on the roll in front of her, and after a moment Mr. Carey said in a perfectly level voice, without looking up from his own work, "In my experience, madam, a man who calls another man a clerk in that particular tone has usually never in his life been any use to anybody." And then he asked her a question about the seal, and the moment passed, and she loved him from about that instant, though it took her 4 more months to say so to herself. On the last evening he thanked her formally and asked one further favour, leave to come again in the spring, and Charlotte said that the muniment room was open to any serious scholar, and would be while she had charge of it, and he said, "That is not quite what I asked," and she looked at him, and he looked back, and neither of them said the next sentence, because she was another man's wife, and because he was, though she did not yet know it, in a position where saying it would have been an act of enormous consequence. He went away on the Wednesday in the hired gig. And it was 11 days after that, going to the third press for the Agincourt Inquisition, that Charlotte found the gap where 4 more charters should have stood, and, on the shelf below, tucked behind the box of duplicate seals as though it had been put down in a hurry by somebody who meant to come back for it, a folded parchment she had never seen in her life, in a 15th century hand, purporting to be a deed of entail of the Beaumain lands, dated the 1st of May. 1461. She read it standing where she found it, and by the 4th line she knew it was a forgery, and by the 10th she knew what it was for. The deed purported to entail the Beaumain lands in the male line only, absolutely and without remainder to heirs general, with a clause providing that on failure of male issue the land should pass, not to the daughters of the house, but to the holder of the neighbouring manor, which after 400 years of conveyances was the Ashbourne estate. If it were genuine, Charlotte Beaumain had never inherited anything, and her father had held those 11 acres as a trespasser. Her marriage settlement, which charged her jointure on the Beaumain lands and reserved the muniments to her absolutely for her life, was founded on property she had never owned. And the whole of it, the manor, the advowson, the almshouse ground, the 900 charters, had belonged to the Dukes of Ashbourne since her great-grandfather's time. She would be, on the day that deed was accepted, a woman with no property, no jointure, and no standing, living in her husband's house entirely on his goodwill, at the precise moment when his goodwill was being administered by Lady Serena Crail. But it was a forgery, and it was to a person who had spent 5 years in that room. A bad one. It was a beautiful piece of work in the physical sense, real 15th century parchment, ink of the right colour, a seal taken from a genuine document of the period, and reattached with a skill Charlotte had to admire. What it could not disguise was the writing itself. The hand was a competent imitation of a 15th century charter hand. But it had been written by somebody trained in modern legal engrossing, and it betrayed him in 20 places once you knew to look. In the letter G, in the ligatures, in the shape of the abbreviation for per, in the appalling consistency of the line spacing, because a 15th century clerk ruled his parchment, and this man had not. And above all in its legibility, since forgers, wanting to be believed, always write more clearly than the age they copy. And then there was the language. The operative clause used the phrase to and for the use and behoof of the said heirs male and their assigns for ever, and the words use and behoof in that combination came out of a statutory formula of the reign of Queen Anne, and no clerk in 1461 had ever written them, or could have. It was as though a man had forged a letter from Agincourt and dated it the 4th of July. Charlotte stood in the cold muniment room with a document in her hands that would have destroyed her, and what she felt was neither fear nor triumph. It was the professional calm of a woman being handed, at last, the one thing she had been waiting 9 months for, which was a piece of paper that could be made to speak in front of witnesses. She copied it that night, every line, with a note of every diagnostic feature and measurement, put the copy in the deal box under the window seat, and put the original back behind the box of duplicate seals with the fold exactly as she had found it, because a trap is only a trap while the man who set it believes it is still lying quiet. Then she wrote 3 letters. The first went to Dr. Pennant at the Society of Antiquaries, describing the document without naming the parties and asking whether he would, if required, examine it and give an opinion in public. The second went to Mr. Carey, at the address he had left, 6 lines, saying only that a matter had arisen touching the collection on which she would value his judgment, and that she would be grateful if he could come north sooner than the spring. The third she did not send for a week, because it cost her more than the other 2, and it went to Lady Honoria Vale, her husband's aunt, 74 years old, the terror of 3 counties, resident 8 miles off, who had opposed her nephew's marriage on the grounds that a bride without money was an indulgence, and had never troubled to conceal it, and who was the only living person besides Halloway to have been present at the execution of the marriage settlement. What Charlotte did not know, and would learn from Alice within a fortnight, was how little time she now had, because the girl came to her one morning white to the lips, having taken up the business-room coals at 6:30 and found Mr. Halloway already at the desk, and having heard, through the door she had prudently left an inch open, the attorney explaining to his Grace, in the reasonable murmur of a man explaining an investment, that a most remarkable document had come to light among the Beaumain papers, that it appeared to place the whole of the northern property in his Grace's hands, that a private act would tidy the jointure question in a session, and that in the circumstances it would be more comfortable for everybody if the Duchess were established at the dower cottage at Feltham with a suitable allowance before the matter became public. And she had heard the Duke say, not unkindly, that Charlotte would make a fuss about the papers, and Halloway answer that the papers were the property to which the document related, and would of course remain at Ashbourne. And the Duke say, after a pause, "Well, she has her books. She will hardly notice, so long as she has her books." Lady Honoria Vale received her niece by marriage in a house that smelled of beeswax and old dogs, listened for 50 minutes without interrupting, and said, "You have come to me because I am the last person alive who saw that settlement signed, and because you believe I dislike you. I do. I have disliked you for 5 years on the grounds that my nephew married a woman with no money, which I considered vulgar romanticism, and I now find he married a woman with no money in order to hang her ancestors on the wall, which is a great deal more vulgar, and I have been obliged to revise my opinion of the transaction and of myself at 74. Which is not a comfortable age for it. She sent for a japanned deed box and put into Charlotte's hands the executed counterpart of the marriage settlement of 1819, with its schedule of the muniments reserved to the Duchess for her life, and, attached, the abstract of title prepared at the time, which traced the Beaumain lands through 6 generations of heirs general, including 2 daughters, approved by council. and in which no entail to heirs male appeared, because no such entail had ever existed. My brother's attorney, said Lady Honoria, was a bad-tempered old Scotsman who would have found a flaw in the book of Genesis. If there had been an entail on that property, he would have found it. Whatever Halloway has produced, it did not exist 6 years ago. Now what do you require of me? Charlotte said, your presence, ma'am, your attorney, and one thing harder. I require you to say nothing to anybody for 6 weeks. Lady Honoria's face did something complicated, and then she said, you are a cold-blooded creature, and I begin to think you will do very well. Mr. Carey came north within the week, in his own carriage this time, and stood at the muniment room door with his hat in his hand and said, before anything else, madam, I must tell you who I am, and I should have told you in February, and my only defence is that I could not think how to do it without spoiling the best fortnight's work I have had in 10 years. My name is Nicholas Carey. It is not a false name, it is my family's. I am also, and I am sorry for it this morning, the Duke of Caldern. The room was very quiet. Charlotte sat down on the library steps, which was not dignified, and said, the fishery dispute is mine, he said. The estate in the West Riding is mine, and the boundary is mine, and I came to look at your charters, because I do not send other men to read documents I am capable of reading myself, and because Pennant told me the transcripts were extraordinary, and I wanted to see who had made them. Your footman decided I was somebody's archivist, and I let him. Because I have been a duke for 19 years, and have never once been able to work beside a stranger without the room arranging itself around my title, and for 16 days I was permitted to be a man who was good at his subject, sitting beside a woman who was better. And I hoarded it, and that was selfish. And I am telling you now because you wrote to me for help and are entitled to know what you are getting. She said, and what am I getting? He said, the 15th Duke of a line created in 1397, a Knight of the Garter, and a man with a great deal of experience of what precedence is worth and what it is not. Your husband's title was made in 1784 for lending a government money. I say that not out of snobbery, madam. I say it because in about a month it is going to matter enormously, and I want you to have thought about it before it does. Charlotte was silent a moment, and then began to laugh, and could not stop for some time, and the laughter had 5 years in it, and Caldern let her have it out. Forgive me, she said at last. It is only that in October my husband asked a woman in my own conservatory who could possibly want me, and I heard him, and I have carried that sentence ever since like a stone in a shoe, and now you tell me this, and it is such a thundering answer to the question that I cannot be civil about it. He did not smile. He said, then let me be exact, because you have had 5 years of a man who was never exact with you. I have not come here to answer your husband. I came in February for the charters, and I stayed 16 days for the woman, and I went home and wrote to my sister that I had met the only person in England I have ever wanted to marry, and I had not the smallest notion what to do about it, because you were married. And now you are in trouble, and I am not going to speak of any of that again until you are out of it, because a woman deciding whether to fight for her name should not have a man's proposal sitting in the room confusing her. Tell me about the deed. So she told him about the deed, and about use and behoof, and Caldern, who had spent 19 years reading his own muniments, went very still, and then said, Madam, He has forged a document in a house that contains the one woman in England who can read it. Let us take our time and do this properly. They took 6 weeks, and they used them the way an army uses a siege. Dr. Pennant came north in April, ostensibly to see the collection, and spent 2 days with the forged deed under a glass, and produced a written opinion of 11 pages concluding that the instrument was not of the 15th century, that it had been engrossed within 3 years by a person trained in modern conveyancing, and that the seal, though genuine, had been detached from an earlier document and reattached with fish glue. He appended a list of 18 diagnostic points, 16 of which Charlotte had identified in her first reading, and he made a particular note of that fact in a paragraph that she read 4 times and then put away where she would not be tempted to read it again. Calderne's own attorneys went after the missing objects, and what they found turned a family disgrace into a criminal enterprise. The Chantry chalice and paten had been sold in Amsterdam in the year of the imaginary exhibition. 2 of the stolen charters surfaced in a Bond Street dealer's stockbook with a description that could fit nothing else in England, sold in by an unnamed gentleman's agent, and the dealer, faced with an attorney, a magistrate's clerk, and the prospect of receiving stolen property, remembered the agent's face and afterwards, in a room in Ripon, picked Mr. Ezra Halloway's likeness out of 3 without hesitation. 11 documents in all had gone in 3 years for something over £2,000. And Sir Giles Ferrers, the magistrate at Ripon, who had been brought in at Lady Honoria's insistence and had known the second Duke, listened to the whole of it and said the thing that decided the shape of the night. Forgery of a deed with intent to defraud is a capital felony, madam, and I do not think a jury in the North will strain to acquit a London attorney who has been selling the plate out of a chantry. But I will want him taken with his papers. He carries a locked writing case, and he never lets it out of his sight in a strange house. There was one more discovery, and Charlotte made it herself, in a bank abstract Calderne's men had obtained, and it explained the last 5 years in a single line. Lady Serena Crail's debts, £11,000 of them, had been bought up in 3 tranches over 4 years by an intermediary firm, and the firm's instructing client was Halloway. He had not merely been robbing the Duke's wife, he had been keeping the Duke amused, at a price. The mistress, who had spent 4 years teaching a room full of people to laugh at the Duchess'S usefulness, had been retained, quite literally, on a quarterly basis, by the man who needed the Duke's eyes anywhere but on his own papers. Charlotte sat with that for a while, and then she said aloud to Calderne, across the long table, "He is not the villain of this. He is the fool it was built around." And Calderne said, "Yes, does that soften you?" And she said, "It makes me sorry for him, and it does not change one single thing I intend to do, and I find I can hold both of those at once and sleep perfectly well." It was the Duke himself, of course, who provided the stage. The Ashbourne Midsummer Ball was the great fixture of that county's year. 200 guests, and Lucian had determined that this year it would serve a second purpose, since Halloway's act was to go up in the autumn and the ground had to be prepared. And it would be much better done, he thought, in an atmosphere of general goodwill. With the county pleasantly full of his champagne, he informed his wife of the arrangements in June in 8 sentences at breakfast, without looking up. There would be an announcement after supper concerning the family's northern property. It had become clear that certain long-standing arrangements had rested on a misunderstanding of the title. She was not to trouble herself about the legal aspects which Halloway had in hand. It would be more comfortable for her, he thought, to be settled at Feltham before the winter, where she could have her books about her, and Lady Serena had very kindly offered to relieve her of the duties of the house, which had plainly been too much for her. Charlotte buttered her toast and said, "Of course, Lucian, shall I still order the supper?" He said, "Would you? That is good of you," and went out to his horses. And the Duchess of Ashbourne finished her breakfast alone in a room that had a Beaumain shield painted in gold above the chimney-piece, and then went upstairs and wrote 3 notes. One to Dr. Pennant, one to Sir Giles Ferrers, and one to Lady Honoria Vale, all of them saying the same thing in different words. The 24th of June, then, come at 9. Bring everything. And a 4th to Caldern, which said only, "My husband proposes to announce it after supper. Will you come, and will you come as yourself?" The 24th of June was warm, and by 10 o'clock there were 200 people in the staterooms at Ashbourne, and the Duchess of Ashbourne, who had ordered every dish of the supper, received them in grey silk with her mother's garnet cross, the only jewel she owned that had not come with the marriage. Lady Serena Crail wore white and diamonds and stood nearer the head of the stairs than a guest strictly should. Mr. Ezra Halloway arrived at 9 with a locked writing case under his arm, which he declined to give up, and carried into the business room and set on the desk, and did not know that Sir Giles Ferrers's clerk had been sitting in the housekeeper's parlour since 8 with 2 constables and a warrant sworn that afternoon. At 11 Dr. Pennant came, elderly and unfashionable, and was greeted by his hostess with a warmth the county found puzzling. And at 11:30, when the rooms were at their fullest, the butler at the head of the stairs struck his staff twice and announced, in a voice trained for exactly one purpose and rarely given the chance to use it, His Grace, the Duke of Caldern. There are perhaps 4 names in England that will stop 200 people talking, and that was one. Charlotte, at the foot of the stairs, watched the room turn like a field of barley in wind, watched Lady Serena's fan stop halfway to her face, and watched her husband come out of the card-room at a speed that was not quite dignified, because the Duke of Ashbourne, whose grandfather had sold boots to the army, had been trying without success for 19 years to get the Duke of Caldern to acknowledge his existence. Caldern came down the room in a plain black coat with the Star of the Garter on it, greeted his host with precisely the civility owed to a man in whose house one is standing, and then walked past him to the Duchess and bowed over her hand and said, loudly enough for 40 people, "Your Grace, I have come to hear you demolish a document." Supper was at midnight, and Lucian, flushed with the greatest social triumph of his life, rose at the sweets and made his announcement, and made it badly, because the only person in the room he wanted to impress was watching him with grave attention. He said that a discovery among the family papers had clarified the title to the Northern estate, that certain provisions of his marriage settlement had rested on a mistake, that Mr. Halloway would lay the matter before Parliament in the autumn, and that in the meantime the Duchess, whose health had suffered from her studies, would establish herself at Feltham. He said, and this was the sentence that finished him, that it had always been a little absurd, and he hoped his wife would forgive him, that the Vale family should have been in some sense tenants of a set of parchments. And he sat down to the sound of 200 people not quite applauding. And into that awkward silence the Duchess of Ashbourne stood up. She said, "Thank you, Lucian. Since the document is to be laid before Parliament, the company may care to see it first. Sir Giles, would you be so good?" And Ferrers, who had the forged deed in his hand and had had it for 2 hours since Charlotte had walked into the business room at 9 o'clock and taken it from behind the box of duplicate seals in front of the magistrate, and Dr. Pennant and Lady Honoria Vale, rose and laid it on the supper table under the branch of candles. What followed took 20 minutes and was the finest piece of public work anybody in that room ever saw. She did not raise her voice. She read the deed aloud in the original Latin and then translated it, and then she took it apart. She showed them the unruled lines and what a 15th century clerk was paid to do before he began to write. She showed them the letter G, the ligature, the abbreviation for per, and had the candles moved so the nearest 30 could see the same forms in a modern hand, in a lease Mr. Halloway had engrossed for the estate 2 years before, which lay beside it. She held up the seal and showed them the fish glue. And then she came to the clause and said, "And here, my lords and ladies, is where it stops being an opinion. This deed is dated the 1st of May, 1461. Its operative clause conveys to and for the use and behoof of the said heirs male. The words use and behoof in that formula enter English conveyancing from a statute of the reign of Queen Anne. No clerk alive in 1461 had ever heard them, any more than he had heard of the Duke of Ashbourne. Dr. Pennant, is that a fair statement?" And Pennant, on his feet, said, "Madam, it is unanswerable, and I will swear to it in any court in this kingdom." Holloway was not in the room by then. He had gone out during the Latin and reached the business room, where the door was opened for him with great politeness by a constable, and the locked writing case, when Ferrers opened it at 1 o'clock in the morning, contained the dealer's correspondence, the Amsterdam account for the chalice, 2 Beaumain charters not yet sold, and, folded at the bottom, a trial sheet of the 15th century hand, practised 20 times over, with the words use and behoof written out in a modern engrossing hand at the foot of the page. Lady Serena Crail attempted, in the confusion, to leave, and got as far as the hall, where Lady Honoria Vale stood with her stick before the doors and observed, in a voice that carried into the supper-room, that it was curious for a woman to be so eager to go home when her debts had been paid these 4 years by the gentleman now in the business room with the constables, and that the abstract lay on the table if anybody cared to read it. 200 people cared very much. Serena went out past her into the night, was on the Dover road within the week, and ended in Naples on a small annuity from her brother among people who did not know what she had been in England, having taught the world her own arithmetic, that everything, herself included, could be bought by the quarter. And Lucian Vale stood at the head of his own supper table before 200 neighbours and looked at his wife, and to his credit, which is the only credit in this story he can claim, he did not bluster. He said, in a voice that did not work properly, "Is any of it mine? Any of what I said tonight?" And Charlotte said, "No, not a word. The title to my family's land has been good since Henry II, and would have been proved good in 10 minutes by any competent attorney, which is why it was never put before one. He asked you to laugh at me for 5 years, and you did, and while this house laughed he took the Chantry silver, 11 charters, and very nearly everything I have." Then Lucian Vale said, quietly, the most honest sentence of his life. I asked in the conservatory in October who could want you. I did not know you were in the passage. I have known since the following morning, because Mrs. Dunn told me, and I have said nothing for 9 months because I could think of nothing that would not make it worse. And Charlotte answered him in front of all of them, without cruelty, in the voice she used for reading documents aloud. You asked who could want me. The answer stood in your library for a fortnight in a brown coat, and you called him the clerk and told me not to let him keep me from ordering your dinner. That is our marriage in one sentence, and I do not say it to wound you. I say it because it is exactly true, and because nobody in your employment has told you the truth in 5 years. Forgiveness you shall have, and freely. Return, never. Then she dictated her terms, with the candles guttering and the ices melting, written out by Ferrers's clerk before anybody left the house. A bill of divorce, on his adultery unopposed at his charge. Her jointure restored as the settlement provided. Every sold charter and the chantry plate recovered at his expense, and returned to the muniment room, hers absolutely. The almshouse ground conveyed to trustees in perpetuity, the Nash's lease and 11 others renewed for 21 years. Mrs. Dunn pensioned, Alice dowered, and the Beaumain shield taken down from the breakfast-room chimney-piece and sent after her, because it had never been his, and he had never known what it was. He agreed to all of it before Sir Giles Ferrers, and kept every word. Ezra Halloway was tried at York in the spring. The trial sheet with its 20 practised lines was the whole of it, and he was transported for life. And the Duke of Ashbourne stayed at Ashbourne, did not remarry, rebuilt the Beaumain chantry at his own charge over 4 years, endowed a chaplaincy in the name of a family no longer his by any tie, and wrote his former wife 1 letter every October, which was received, read, and kept unanswered in a deal box under a window seat. Charlotte and Nicholas Carré were married 18 months later in the parish church at Beaumain, with the roof on it for the first time in 60 years, the plainest wedding a duke of that house had ever made. 9 old women from the almshouse in the front pews, the Nash children scattering meadow-sweet, Dr. Pennant giving the bride away, and Lady Honoria Vale, who had invited herself, informing the county from the second pew that she had never been so pleased to be wrong about anybody. He asked her the question in the muniment room, among the charters, standing up and plainly. "I wanted you the first hour," he said, "when you corrected my reading of the formula and did not apologize for it. Will you marry me?" And she said yes, and then made him wait while she finished the entry. Because she was who she was. Years afterwards, scholars came from 4 countries to a building at Caldern, the Beaumain Library, 900 charters and 12 volumes of transcripts under a Duchess'S own catalogue, with a school attached where girls were taught Latin and the old hands and paid a wage while they learned, on the founder's principle that a woman who can read what others cannot is never at anybody's mercy. Her children learned their letters from 13th century seals. And when one of her daughters came home at 17 crying because a boy at an assembly had said, loud enough to be heard, that nobody would ever want her, the Duchess of Caldern put down her pen and said the sentence that family has repeated since. Being wanted is a thing other people decide in a room you are not in, and it tells you nothing whatever about your worth. Go and learn something difficult, keep what you know, and be useful to people who cannot pay you back, and one day the door will open. And it will be somebody who wanted you all along. And by then, my darling, you will have stopped waiting at it.